Hello, my gentle and of course very modern apes. Recently, I received a challenge, and a very strange one at that.
The person it's about is a parasite who thrives off of attention and controversy.
Donnie Deals of the Standing for Truth YouTube channel has proposed that there is, in fact, unassailable evidence that accelerated nuclear decay has occurred in the crust of the Earth, and that, thus, young Earth creationism is true, actually. If you're new here, first of all, I'm sorry, you've met with a terrible fate, haven't you? But this is very interesting to me for a myriad of different reasons, both scientific and philosophical. Before we really discuss the challenge, allow me to give you a bit of background. According to geology, biology, chemistry, physics, astronomy, and indeed many other fields, the Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. This is a number that is gleaned from rates that occur in numerous different minutiae of these various fields, but commonly put forward is the idea that this is supported by radiometric dating, which is rooted in radioactive decay. Essentially, the oldest rocks that we find on Earth, when they are radiometrically dated, show the Earth to be approximately 4.5 billion years old. Radiometric dating relies on very simple principles in physics and in quantum physics. In alignment with the radioactive decay law, unstable isotopes will spontaneously decay into more stable forms at a constant rate depending on the isotope in question. Uranium-235 decays into lead-207 with a half-life of 7,000 million years, or 7 billion years. The half-life is just the time it takes for a substance to decrease by half. So with the decay rates known, and they do not change in significant ways in nature, we've tried, known initial conditions known, and final conditions known, both of which are observed without exception, that decay starts with all parent material and ends with all daughter, we can tell how old the sample is simply by looking at the ratio of parent to daughter material in a given rock. Young Earth creationists like Donnie of Standing for Truth believe that the Earth is 6,000 years old. This means that in order to explain the dates of rocks that are 4.5 billion years old, or indeed anything that is older than 6,000 years old, they have to invoke something called accelerated nuclear decay. This is basically normal nuclear decay, accepted in conventional science, except on super, mega, ultra fast forward.
Are you serious?
Generally speaking, creationists propose that this accelerated nuclear decay happened in the creation week and also during Noah's flood. So this is somewhere between 4.5 billion years of decay to 500 million years of nuclear decay, crammed into a period of time that is about 1 year if we're looking at Noah's flood. This is problematic because, one, you can't speed up nuclear decay in meaningful ways in nature. This has been shown to us time and time again by scientific experiments because speeding up nuclear decay would be huge for the energy industry. But moreover, nuclear decay releases heat. Every time it happens, a bit of heat is released, even if we're looking at a single decay from one isotope to another. This means that if you're cramming 4.5 billion years of nuclear decay, or just 500 million years of nuclear decay, into the single year of Noah's flood, that's a lot of heat release. By taking the heat output today and applying it back in time, we end up with 1.68 times 10 raised 30 joules of energy for major nuclear decay chains over the past 4.5 billion years. This is equivalent to 4.01 times 10 raised 14 1 megaton hydrogen bombs. This means every cubic kilometer gets its own 402 hydrogen bombs, and every square kilometer gets its own 787,884 hydrogen bombs. 500 million years worth of decay is 1.86 times 10 raised 29 joules and equivalent to 4.45 times 10 raised 13 hydrogen bombs. This is equivalent to 87,237 H-bombs per square kilometer. This is a comically insane number of hydrogen bombs, clearly untenable, and produces lethal amounts of heat. Needless to say, the arc is not there anymore. We've got Earth as just a ball of churning plasma. But let's put it another way. University of Florida geologist Joe Meert did the math and showed the thermal gradient if you start accelerating decay at creation results in an immediate temperature of 65,000 degrees Celsius per kilometer, and that by the time Noah's Ark has occurred, it has cooled to 40,000 degrees Celsius per kilometer and 400 degrees Celsius per kilometer by Jesus' birth. This is over 10 times hotter than the surface of the sun.
That sucks. I mean...
You might think, okay, but that's secular folks, right? They're going to be extra mean to creationists. But young Earth creationists have their own numbers, and they're not better. Andrew Snelling, a young Earth creationist geologist and one of the first to even propose the idea of accelerated nuclear decay as a part of his time at the RATE team, gives them a bit more leeway by only accelerating nuclear decay for the past 500 million years, allowing the previous several billion to have accelerated during the first 3 days of creation week. But according to him, this still results in enough energy to heat the Earth to a temperature of more than 22,000 degrees Celsius per kilometer. Institute for Creation Research member Larry Vargman notes, the amount of heat produced by a decay rate of 1 million times faster than normal during the flood could potentially vaporize the Earth's oceans, melt the crust, and obliterate the surface of the Earth. And that's just the heat from accelerating the nuclear decay. John Baumgartner, who's worked for Answers in Genesis, proposes catastrophic plate tectonics to get the continents in their current positions from a previous supercontinent. This means during the flood, the continents moved regular plate tectonic style, but again at super fast forward speed. And he proposes that the energy released, the thermal energy released for that type of subduction would be 10 raised 28 joules. Running contra to catastrophic plate tectonics is Walt Brown's hydroplate hypothesis, which has the heat release of 5,000 trillion 1 megaton H-bombs. None of this is tenable. Every flood model requires a miracle, and this is something that has been noted by the big young Earth creationist organizations today, including Answers in Genesis, CMI, and ICR. Obviously, if it's miraculous, the science world simply doesn't care anymore. It becomes outside of the purview of investigation for natural sciences, and I include myself in that category. I don't care. If you want to say it's miraculous, I literally cannot argue against you. But here's Donnie suggesting that whether it's miraculous or not, we know for certain that accelerated nuclear decay happened. We know this empirically, he purports. And he uses strong words for this too.
Accelerated decay has happened. Okay, that's the most important point. There is no heat problem, guys. There is no heat problem, guys. There is no heat problem, guys.
Oh, shit. Here we go again.
So, okay, on what basis is he proposing this? I'm going to let Donnie explain.
Okay, so this is where I want to get into the so-called heat problem, which you absolutely dismantled, Matt. I appreciate it.
Because of zircon crystals.
Zircon crystals.
But they've never dealt with the fact that these radiohalos and fission tracks, they exist, and yet they're obliterated at relatively low temperatures. If there was no rapid cooling during the flood, okay, during these accelerated processes, because we have the critics that are essentially saying that this heat would have melted the crust, boiled the oceans, the radiation would have killed Noah, killed the ark animals. Well, if there was that much heat, and that heat did not be taken up in all these various heat sinks, and there was not some kind of supercooling, well, we wouldn't have these radiohalos and fission tracks because they would be obliterated, but they're there. And the best explanation for them is accelerated nuclear decay. You see how the evolutionists, the uniformitarians, the actualists, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
More or less, Donnie is proposing that fission tracks and radiohalos are proof that accelerated nuclear decay did in fact happen. Moreover, he elaborates, fission tracks have a low annealing temperature. This means if the temperature in the rocks gets too hot, like the rocks perhaps around volcanically active areas, the fission tracks disappear. So, Donnie reasons, it must not have gotten too hot. There must not have been too much heat. Therefore, no heat problem. Better yet, and I couldn't believe this, truly, Donnie promises that if his argument is bad this time, he will admit that the heat problem is currently unsolved. He will finally own that.
And you know what? If I get a sufficient response to that, I'll admit that currently there's no solution to the heat problem.
And I just couldn't resist, especially given what the arguments are. Donnie bills this, his challenge, as like this huge gotcha, and it's got my jaw on the floor. Because this is plainly circular reasoning, right? But I also don't think he knows his own argument very well, or his own literature. Let's back up a minute. Donnie is pulling all of his reasoning from the work of the RATE team. The RATE team, RATE standing for Radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth, is a think tank of young Earth creationist professionals that formed in 1997. Their goal was to investigate the validity of radioisotope dating of rocks over the course of an 8-year research program. Volume 1 released in 2000 and Volume 2 in 2005. The reason you don't hear too much about their groundbreaking work in debunking the age of the Earth is because it was kind of a bust.
I am shocked! Shocked! Well, not that shocked.
Their main findings can be outlined in their summary publication, although both volumes can be found online. They note some interesting things. In bold, they write, 3 general geophysical conclusions were drawn from the RATE research. Number 1, a large amount of radioactive decay has occurred. Number 2, nuclear decay processes were accelerated during episodes in Earth's history. And number 3, conventional radioisotope dates are therefore incorrect by large factors. Okay, what? That first line is emphasized a few paragraphs above, where the authors unequivocally argue that there is no way around it. Billions of years worth of decay has occurred. Well, at least they finally caught up with conventional science, huh? Better late than never. But here is where things get interesting. As you saw, right after copping to the decay, they suggest that accelerated nuclear decay happened, and upon that, they propose that dates are inaccurate. The linchpin here is obviously point 2, because point 3 is irrelevant without it. So what was the proof that accelerated nuclear decay clearly occurred? Donnie seems to be proposing that it is fission tracks and radiohalos, but what does the RATE team say? Well, curiously, fission tracks are just not listed as a support for the accelerated nuclear decay, now are they? Nope, just helium diffusion, radiohalos, discordant dates, and carbon-14 in coal and diamonds. Now, why might that be? Donnie, you little goober, you didn't read past the original claim, did you? You didn't read your own source, even though the title alone should have clued you in. The fission tracks paper primarily notes that fission tracks are evidence that a large amount of radioactive decay has occurred. That's it. Snelling extrapolates several times and notes that if the flood happened, and if 500 million years worth of decay happened in the 1 year of the flood, then fission tracks can make sense in that context because accelerated nuclear decay requires decay in the first place. Fission tracks are of course used to date rocks within conventional science, and they, as Snelling pointed out, only mean that nuclear decay has occurred. They don't support the young Earth creationist worldview unless it is assumed first, as Snelling himself says. Now, here's the critical part. Fission tracks disappear if there's too much heat in the rock. This is called the annealing temperature. And Snelling notes that some fission tracks appear to have disappeared. He thinks, though, that the reason these fission tracks have vanished is because they were heated, the heat being from accelerated nuclear decay. But Donnie disagrees with him here, because Donnie proposes that
They would be obliterated by this excess amount of heat. But the fact they're there for us to observe, what's suggested here, if there had been a heat problem due to accelerated radioactive and nuclear decay, then we should not find these scars in the rocks.
So you guys have differing opinions then. You think that the presence of fission tracks in general means that there was no excessive heat released. And Snelling thinks that because some fission tracks have disappeared, clearly there was an excessive amount of heat at some point during the flood. Snelling gives an annealing range at time of publication as 200 to 300 degrees Celsius, which is a temperature dwarfed by his own proposed heat release of 2200 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So Donnie's actually right here, because if there was heat as Snelling proposes and as conventional science would purport, then the fission tracks just shouldn't be there. There should be no fission tracks, period, in flood rock. Snelling knows this, and he notes that if we can assume there is a way for heat to dissipate, he can still explain the presence of the fission tracks. And since the RATE team has left the door open for miraculous solutions as far as the heat problem, I don't think we need to assume what he thinks the dissipator of all this heat was. It was a miracle. Donnie sees the presence of the fission tracks and he thinks, oh, okay, well then there was no massive amount of heat. The heat must have gone somewhere. His reasoning is there was a flood, so there had to be a lot of heat. If there was a lot of heat, you can't have fission tracks. There are fission tracks, therefore the heat was solved. This reasoning is circular. The presence of fission tracks unequivocally prove that the Earth was not heated to 22,000 degrees Celsius to 65,000 degrees Celsius. But that doesn't mean that there's not a heat problem. It means the flood didn't happen. Because if there was a flood, and if there was a heat problem, and there shouldn't be fission tracks, finding fission tracks doesn't mean that the heat problem was miraculously solved. It means there was no heat problem, which means there was no flood to initiate the heat problem. So Donnie here is taking a normal process that is easily explainable by conventional science. Nuclear decay results in fission tracks, simple, and he's adding like a dozen other unnecessary steps just to say that this normal, conventionally explained thing is actually better explained by a series of mental gymnastic stunts in order to make his miraculous worldview make sense. And insanely, it just happens to look like conventional science was operating in a normal fashion. If we found a car that had crashed into a tree with tire tracks leading from the road to the tree, I think it's reasonable to say that the car drove straight into the tree. There is no indication that anything else happened. Donnie is proposing that the car quantum tunneled backward through the tree and then crashed into it in a way that looks mundane. It's silly. Because like the car quantum tunneling, we don't have support that accelerated nuclear decay even can happen, let alone that it did. Donnie needs a mechanism for the accelerated nuclear decay, and then another mechanism for the simultaneous accelerated cooling that he seems to be on about lately. And in addition to that, we need to have heat mitigation mechanisms for every other possible source of heat during the flood, for the impact events, for the cooling of limestone, for the hardening of magma, for the movement of the continents atop the mantle, creating massive amounts of friction. Because there are fission tracks in proposed flood rock, and that rock cannot heat above 300 degrees Celsius. So Donnie, you busted yourself here. You didn't even need my help. Fission tracks can't survive very much heating, so there was not a global flood.
Hey, old man, give me everything.
Call an ambulance! Call an ambulance! But not for me!
Oh, wait, shoot. Now we gotta talk about radiohalos. I've already covered helium diffusion as well as discordant dates generally and the carbon-14 in dinosaur bones and coal in other locations, so we'll do radiohalos here since he specifically asked for fission tracks and radiohalos. Radiohalos are tiny circular geologic structures found in minerals like biotite and fluorite. In the center of some radiohalos is a radioactive zircon, a little crystal thing that emits alpha particles of radiation that race into the surrounding minerals and occasionally slam into stationary atoms, leaving a halo of damage. There are halos in many kinds of rocks, but the RATE team, and thus Donnie, likes polonium halos as their support. This is because polonium has a short half-life, and granite, which is where the minerals biotite and fluorite are found, takes a long time to cool. This has led creationist Robert Gentry in the past to argue that rocks containing polonium halos must have been created during the creation week way back in the 70s. Oddly enough, the RATE team disagrees with this, namely because they found halos in rock that Gentry would tacitly say is not creation week rock. They do, however, argue that given the short life of polonium, fractions of a second to days they argue, these halos could only form under a condition of rapid decay and rapid cooling of magma. Unlike fission tracks, Snelling proposes that there is no reasonable explanation for radiohalos under a conventional timescale. So is that true? No! And we got a twist this time that Donnie's just gonna love. Gentry has since passed away, but Snelling still argues with conventional geology about these radiohalos. The most recent piece I've seen by him was Radiohalos, Solving the Mystery of the Missing Bullets from 2014, which is kind of old. In it, he argues that polonium is primarily transported by hot water seeping through granite during the flood and its precursor form, radon gas. So uranium-238 decays, radon and some polonium are transported by hot water flowing through granite, and then, with the help of sulfur, the polonium settles out of the water, and as the temperature drops below 150 degrees Celsius, the annealing temperature, it forms polonium halos in biotite and fluoride within granite. Snelling argues two things specifically. First, the geologic conditions here are only found during the flood, and second, accelerated nuclear decay is still required to generate enough polonium atoms, given a halo needs approximately 500 million atoms to form. Thus, his argument is that only the flood can explain polonium halos. Let's unravel this mystery. Polonium results from the decay of uranium-238, where it undergoes decay through several other elements before reaching radon and polonium. Geologist Lawrence Collins has studied radiohalos extensively and has shown some solid work that radiohalos actually can and do occur in nature. Without the need of a global flood, I mean. Collins reports that the granite that contains polonium radiohalos is not primary that has crystallized from magma, but is a secondary chemical replacement product in which former already crystallized plutonic igneous rocks, which are presently below 450 degrees Celsius, such as diorite, have been microfractured such that hot water or steam can move through the rock at temperatures below melting temperatures that subtract iron, magnesium, aluminum, and calcium from such a rock at the same time, inducing silica and potassium to convert the rock into granite. His model of this process was published out of his university in 2014. During this process, uranium in scattered crystals in the rock is continually releasing radioactive radon and polonium ions so that this radon and polonium can diffuse through grain boundary fractures and into the fractured biotite crystals. To be clear, steam is not transporting the radon, it is naturally diffusing. The creation of a polonium radiohalo then only requires a nucleation site to form in the core of a halo, and the progressive growth of this core by the addition of incoming polonium will eventually produce more than 500 million atoms in the tiny core that will produce a recognizable dark halo in the adjacent biotite lattice. This diffusion may occur over, say, 10,000 years or more as repeated earthquakes fracture the rock and keep the rock an open system for diffusion of elements. Put simply, polonium radiohalos can only form in granite created by chemical replacement processes at temperatures below melting conditions. However, polonium radiohalos can form in granite pegmatites where uranium is concentrated in water-rich accumulations that allow large biotite books to form during the late-stage crystallization of granite magma. Snelling's model also fails on its own. His idea on the origin of polonium radiohalos by rapid diffusion into biotite in granite that is rapidly cooling from a melt cannot stand up to physical processes. His molten granite water flow fails because it is effectively a closed system, and his fast cooling granite has been shown in a lab to be simply impossible. There also exists no mechanism to move the water through his crystallizing rock magma. Put simply, radiohalos can form by natural conditions, and the creationist explanations for radiohalos, including Gentry's created halos and Snelling's flood halos, fail for mechanical reasons and inconsistencies. But the twist here for Donnie is that these radiohalos actually anneal at 150 degrees Celsius, meaning if your accelerated nuclear decay happened, you necessarily require now an instant accelerated cooling, or else it simply didn't happen, and we don't have evidence for either of those things. So the flood, of course, didn't occur.
Accelerated decay has happened. Okay, that's the most important point.
There we go. How do they not get it? How can you be that proud of yourself?
I think I've done more than a sufficient job here explaining why Donnie's arguments, hijacked and butchered as they are, do not work. The science behind his source, the rate team, is bad, yes, but his reasoning as an individual is also devastatingly warped. I certainly hope that Donnie keeps up his end of the bargain here and admits at long last that he does have a heat problem no matter what flood model he uses.
We'll analyze it, and you know what? If I get a sufficient response to that, I'll admit that currently there's no solution to the heat problem.
And that this is kind of just an unsolvable problem as admitted by pretty much every other mainstream creationist. You can say you're working on it if you want, that's what AIG does, but as of right now, there is no non-miraculous solution to the heat problem. I feel that he might actually cough up an admission that this is an unsolvable issue and that he does have a heat problem, but I feel like in the same breath he's just going to move forward and say, but have you considered that conventional science also has a lot of questions? There are unsolved questions in science. In fact, there are absolutely oodles of them. That's what makes it fun. But the problem for young Earth creationism here isn't that the heat problem is unsolved. It's that the heat problem is unsolvable. Right now, physics precludes the worldview entirely. Still, I look forward to hearing what he has to say. In the meantime, my gentle and of course very modern apes, please do take care of yourselves. And if you like what I do on this channel, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and if you want to support me in other ways, you can head on over to my Patreon. I am a TA and I have a mortgage to pay, so think about it, and I will catch you on the flip side.